Hey guys, tonight we're slipping quietly past at the creaking door of a candlelit chamber where the air smells faintly of beeswax and wet wool, and the sheets are about as soft as a grain sack. The fire's barely smoldering in the hearth, and you're shivering half from the cold, half from what's expected of you. You're not alone, your spouse is beside you, equally unsure, equally nervous, both of you fully aware that somewhere someone from the church might be scribbling a note about how many times you should be allowed to do this per week. You probably won't survive this, so before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is over there. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You lie on the edge of a splintery bed fully clothed, because nudity in some circles was seen as a spiritual danger. Medieval church doctrine wasn't just wagging fingers at infidelity or gluttony. It had a vice grip on bedroom life itself. Sex in theory was only for procreation. Pleasure suspicious. Any act not specifically aimed at making babies was marked as sinful even in marriage. The idea of scheduling intimacy wasn't just a modern invention. Some clergy wrote guides dictating when it was not acceptable to get busy Sundays, Wednesdays, Fridays, Lent, Advent, feast days, fast days, and of course any time you weren't feeling particularly holy, which left you with maybe a generous Tuesday or two per month. Historians still argue whether these guidelines were strictly enforced, or more like the church's idealized version of morality. There's reason to believe many people nodded along in public, but followed their own instincts once the doors were shut and the chickens stopped pecking outside. Even within marriage, rules could feel suffocating. You weren't supposed to enjoy yourself too much. A husband was to know his wife, yes, but gently, modestly, ideally in the dark, and preferably without any smiling. And yet the very existence of so many sermons about sinful lust suggests a lot of people were definitely doing more than just missionary on scheduled days. For noble couples, things were trickier. Nobility married for alliances, not attraction. You might be paired with someone who spoke a different dialect, worshipped differently, or just smelled medieval. And consummating the marriage wasn't a private matter, it was a civic obligation. The church often demanded proof of consummation, sometimes involving witnesses or at least a public display of bloodied sheets the next morning. Romantic rite. And while we're here, don't expect too much privacy. Peasant homes had one room, maybe two, often shared with extended family. And yes, the kids could be right there. Many households shared beds out of necessity. Curtains, if you were lucky to have them, didn't muffle the sound of awkward fumbles or whispered prayers. You learn quickly that the room you're in isn't just a bedroom, it's a moral battleground. One priest in the 13th century declared that a husband and wife could sin even within marriage if they pursued intimacy with too much enthusiasm. In other words, a good time could land you in purgatory. On the lighter side, there were guides. Yes, actual guides written by clerics on appropriate bedroom behavior. These were filled with bizarre advice like how to avoid hellfire by abstaining during eclipses, or why you should never make love while drunk, lest a demon sneak in with your unborn child. Imagine that being part of your pillow talk. And yet, despite all this pressure, people found ways to love, lust, and laugh. Medieval romance ballads hint at passion longing, and plenty of trysts that defied church expectations. One fringe tidbit: some couples believed sleeping with your clothes on would confuse the devil. Others claimed certain positions attracted unclean spirits, so they avoided anything that might look too creative. So here you are in a bed that's more spiritual minefield than honeymoon suite, with a spouse who might be as clueless as you and a calendar full of holy days saying, "Not tonight." But beneath it all, you feel the pull of something universal, desire, tenderness, curiosity. Despite the freezing sheets, the judgmental sky, and the parish priest who somehow knows your schedule, you lean in. You wake up the next morning still tangled in scratchy wool blankets, and your nose wrinkles before your eyes even open. The smell in the room is layered. Sweat, wood smoke, damp hay, and something faintly sour that might be last week's stew. That's just how it is here. Bathing is optional, and deodorant hasn't been invented yet. You glance over at your spouse, who is definitely wearing yesterday's clothes, and maybe the day before's. So are you. Welcome to medieval hygiene, where foreplay often includes praying neither of you has fleas. Daily bathing by medieval standards was a sign of vanity or madness. Sure, public bathhouses existed, especially in larger towns, but those were a mixed bag, half spa, half brothel, and full of judgment if you seemed to enjoy yourself too much. For many people, especially peasants, bathing happened seasonally. Maybe, if the weather was nice, and if the pond wasn't frozen. You splash your face with water from a basin in the corner. It's cold. It's also a little green. That bar of soap is more lye and animal fat than anything pleasantly scented. Still, it's what people had. Your teeth, well, if you're lucky, they're all still there. People used cloth rags, twigs, or ash to try and keep them clean. Kissing wasn't always about romance, it was a test of courage. Historians still argue whether medieval people were truly filthy or just differently clean. There's evidence that many wanted to be cleaner aristocrats, often owned scented gloves, herbs to mask body odor, and linen underclothes that could be swapped out daily. But without modern plumbing, running water, or reliable soap, let's just say musk was part of your aura. Now in the bedroom, that aroma lingers. You're close enough to feel each other's breath, but the mood is complicated. Sensuality exists, but it often fights a losing battle against discomfort. Mattresses are sacks of straw or horsehair crawling with lice. You scratch your shoulder and wonder if it's nerves or something living on you, and yet people made it work. They fell in love. They craved affection. One of the more surprising things, love letters from this era, some deeply passionate, others hilariously awkward. One 12th century letter describes longing to press thy bosom unto mine with warm desire, while also complaining about the coldness of thy last reply. Emotional whiplash, medieval style. Now let's talk about beds. If you're a noble, you might have a 4-poster frame with drapes, a feather mattress, and something resembling luxury, though still with that musty smell of old furs and unwashed linen. If you're a peasant, it's a pile of straw in the corner, shared with your spouse, 2 kids, and maybe a goat. Sounds cozy, right? A quirky tidbit. Some people believed certain herbs like rosemary, lavender, and wormwood placed in the bed would ward off evil spirits and bad smells. They weren't wrong about the smells, at least. Intimacy then wasn't just a matter of desire. It was a logistical puzzle. You had to be clean enough, warm enough, and this one's key not on the wrong day of the week, according to the local priest. And even then, you had to hope you weren't being overheard by relatives, neighbors, or livestock. Because yes, that sheep in the corner has definitely seen things. And yet for all the hardship, there's a softness here too. People clung to one another in cold winters. They whispered promises by candlelight. They carved tiny hearts into wood beams or tucked dried flowers under pillows. These small acts of intimacy remind us that love, real, messy, sweaty love, has always found a way. So as you lie back and try not to think too hard about what's poking you from beneath the mattress, you realize this is normal. This is life. And whether it smells like lavender or goat, whether it's in silk sheets or on hay, it's still connection, still longing, still human. It's your wedding night. But before you reach for your new spouse's hand, you might want to glance toward the door. Because if you're a peasant, you're lucky if anyone cares what happens next. But if you're nobility, there's a chance the local lord is waiting to exercise a little something called jus primae noctis, the alleged rite of the first night. Whether this was a real widespread practice or more medieval myth than medieval mandate is still debated. Historians argue fiercely about whether jus primae noctis ever happened at all. Some think it was propaganda used centuries later to make feudal lords look even worse than they already did. Others believe isolated cases may have occurred especially in areas with weak legal protections. Either way, the mere idea of it haunted the minds of many marrying couples. Imagine looking into your new bride or groom's eyes only to be told, "Hang tight, your turn comes after the baron." But even if the local lord isn't lurking with sinister intentions, noble marriages are far from romantic affairs. You probably didn't choose your spouse. You might have met them once, maybe twice. Marriages were business deals sealed with lands, livestock, and alliances. Love was optional. Fertility was mandatory. The wedding ceremony itself is done probably in a church with Latin vows you didn't fully understand. There's a feast, some dancing, maybe a juggler who drinks too much and falls into a pig trough. And then comes the bedding ceremony. You hope they'll just leave you alone, but no. In some households, it's a whole event. Guests follow you to the chamber, carrying torches, singing bawdy songs, and making very unhelpful suggestions. A priest might bless the bed. Your clothes might be removed by relatives. And yes, there's clapping. Lots of clapping. It's less romantic first night together and more halftime show sponsored by Aunt Mildred and the village choir. One fringe detail. In some regions, guests would actually sit outside the bedroom and wait for sounds of consummation. Silence meant suspicion. The stakes were high. If you didn't perform, the marriage might be declared invalid. And if you were a noblewoman failing to produce proof of virginity, could cause a scandal or an annulment. Speaking of proof, many families required the bloody bedsheets as evidence. These were sometimes displayed the next morning like a very unsettling flag of victory. If there was no blood, explanations had to be made. Some women, nervous and under pressure, reportedly pricked their own fingers or used sheep's blood. Others ran. Meanwhile, for many newlyweds, especially younger ones, this was less a romantic evening and more a terrifying ordeal. Consent as we understand it today wasn't exactly on the radar. A young bride might be 14, her groom 30, and neither one fully prepared. Instructions, if given, came from older relatives or religious pamphlets that mentioned seed and honor, but avoided anything actually useful. And yet, amid the awkwardness, fear, and obligations, real tenderness sometimes bloomed. Letters from noble couples written years later show affection, jokes, and shared memories. A few brave souls even defied tradition and married for love, like the 12th century couple Heloise and Abelard, whose tragic romance scandalized Europe. But for now, back in your chamber, you're trying to remember what the priest said about avoiding lustful thoughts. You're both exhausted. The fire is dying, and someone outside the door just made a pun about plowing fields. You sigh. So much for a quiet night. Still, as the laughter fades and the room goes dark, you turn toward your new partner. The blanket is rough, the bed lumpy, and your heart's racing, but maybe, just maybe, you'll make your own meaning of this moment. Even if the Baron does knock on the door. Morning sunlight filters in through cracks in the wooden shutters, landing squarely on the stained bed sheets bunched at your feet. You blink awake, disoriented, and then it hits you. Today, those linens might go on parade. In many communities, especially among nobility and upwardly mobile peasants, your private night is about to become a very public matter. The custom of virginity testing isn't just about blood on sheets. It's about proving the marriage was consummated, especially if there's inheritance or social status on the line. No pressure. Servants may come in to witness the aftermath, poking through the bedding with a level of professionalism that's honestly disturbing. In some places, the sheets are carried to the bride's family. In others, they're shown to the grooms, sometimes even hung from a window, fluttering like a medieval Yelp review of your honeymoon. The presence or absence of blood is treated like divine evidence. But let's be clear, science disagrees. Even today, we know the hymen doesn't always bleed and can break long before any wedding night. But back then, nuance was not in fashion. If the expected proof didn't appear, whispers spread. Some women tried to stain the sheets with pricked fingers. Others were accused of impurity, punished, or sent home in shame. Historians still argue whether this ritual was truly as widespread as some chroniclers claimed, or more symbolic in most households. It may have been more common in elite families where dowries and alliances were at stake. But even among peasants, the pressure to perform to prove was never far away. For men, things weren't exactly easier. A husband who failed to consummate the marriage might be called before a court. And no, we don't mean metaphorically. You could literally be required to describe in humiliating detail what happened or didn't. In France, a man might be ordered to show his virility before witnesses. Let that sink in. One famous case even included a reenactment with the man and his wife lying under observation. Romantic, right? And let's talk bedding. Sheets were valuable, woven linen was time-consuming to make. You didn't own many. A stained sheet was both proof of chastity and a symbol of pride preserved like a family relic. In some households, it was displayed at future weddings. Nothing says happily ever after like showing your grandkids grandma's first night. Quirky custom alert in certain rural areas, guests would sing chanson de la chambre, or bedroom songs outside the door to encourage or tease the couple. Imagine trying to be intimate while your uncle belts out a folk tune about goats and fertility. That's medieval pressure. And if all of this seems invasive, remember privacy was rare. Homes were communal spaces. Intimacy was a social act wrapped in layers of custom and expectation. Today's standards of personal space just didn't exist. You were part of a larger network. Your body, your choices, your marriage were all woven into the community's fabric, which is beautiful in one sense and deeply uncomfortable in another. And yet, humans adapt. Over time, even these rituals grew more symbolic, more flexible. Some couples skipped them altogether. Others went through the motions and moved on. As with so much in medieval life, the letter of the law was often less important than the performance. So here you are watching, as someone, maybe your mother-in-law, maybe a grinning chambermaid, lifts the sheet from your bed and nods approvingly. You wish you could disappear into the mattress, but you smile. Because in this world, reputation isn't earned in silence. It's shouted from windows, sung at doors, and yes, stained into linens for all to see. The next evening arrives, and romance, if you can call it that, takes place under a thatched roof between wooden walls that let in every gust of wind and every neighbor's sneeze. You're not in a castle. You're not in a courtly bedroom. You're in a peasant's hut, and the scene is rustic, to say the least. Your bed is a sack of straw thrown across a wooden frame if you're lucky. More often, it's just a pile of hay tucked beside the hearth, maybe softened with old cloaks or sheepskins. The fire is low, the smoke curls overhead, and a chicken might be perched near your head. Because here, the livestock lives with you. Space is scarce. Most peasants shared one room with their family, their animals, and their dreams of a better mattress. Privacy. That's a luxury. You might whisper sweet nothings to your spouse while your grandmother snores 2 feet away and your baby fusses by your knees. Still, people made do. Couples found ways to steal moments of intimacy. A quick embrace behind a haystack. A moonlit walk past the village well. Or yes, fumbling under the blankets while pretending to sleep, though the goat watching from the corner might silently judge you. Historians still argue whether peasant intimacy was more repressed or more relaxed than among the nobility. On one hand, there was less oversight. No clerics hovering over every movement. No bedding ceremonies. No noble politics. But on the other hand, the communal nature of life meant your business was everyone's business. One misplaced sigh and the gossip would spread faster than the plague. Let's talk logistics. There were no nightgowns, no pajamas. You probably slept in your shift or tunic if you didn't strip down entirely to avoid bed lice. And that straw mattress, it rustles loudly. Each movement announces itself. That's why many couples moved outside when the weather allowed fields, barns, even graveyards if they were bold. Yes, graveyards. Apparently nothing says romance like the fresh scent of holy soil and the threat of eternal damnation. And if you did manage to enjoy a private moment, you better hope you don't wake up with a rash. Parasites were a part of life. Bed bugs, fleas, lice, you name it. One fringe tidbit, some folks hung bundles of herbs from the rafters to drive out the pests and promote passion. Lavender for calm, rosemary for remembrance, and mugwort for stimulation. Nature's little helpers. Back to the emotional side, peasant marriages weren't always arranged. Many couples genuinely chose each other. They'd grown up in the same village, tended the same fields, danced at the same harvest festivals. Love, though rarely poetic, was real, practical, grounded. You might not quote sonnets, but you'd share your last loaf of bread, and that counts for something. Even church doctrine treated peasants differently. Clerics didn't expect them to follow all the rules. They barely had time to keep up with feast days. Survival came first. That leniency didn't mean full freedom, but it offered some breathing room. And children. They came quickly. Contraception wasn't encouraged, far from it. But that didn't mean it didn't happen. Herbal remedies, timing methods, and whispered folk knowledge passed between women behind closed doors. some worked, some didn't. Either way, the risk of pregnancy was constant and often life-threatening. Still, you curl beside your spouse under a shared cloak, listening to the crackle of embers and the snoring of your brother on the other side of the room. Your fingers find each other's in the dark. You whisper a joke, stifle a laugh, and for a moment, amid the straw and the smoke and the sleepy goat eyes watching from the rafters, there's warmth. Because even here in the humblest corners of the medieval world, affection finds a way. It might not be elegant, it might not be clean, but it's human, and that's enough. You stretch beneath the creaky rafters and consider trying something new tonight. But hold on before you roll over and get creative. You might want to consult your nearest confessor. Because in medieval Europe, not all bedroom activities were created equal. In fact, there was only one truly acceptable position missionary, and preferably with your eyes closed and your soul begging forgiveness. Everything else that's playing with fire. You might be thinking, surely they didn't care that much, right? But they did. Church doctrine had entire manuals, penitentials, detailing every imaginable position, act, and thought. And most of them ended in stern warnings or prescribed penances. Oral intimacy, mortal sin. Rear entry, definitely mortal sin. Standing up, sin. On your side, still sin. Even wanting something unconventional could land you with 3 weeks of fasting or a pilgrimage. Historians still argue whether these rules were widely enforced or just theoretical. It's likely many people nodded solemnly to the priest, then went home and broke half a dozen of those taboos by candlelight. But the fear was always there, the invisible eye of God watching your every twitch beneath the blankets. One infamous 11th century text suggested that couples who enjoyed intercourse too much, yes, even within marriage, would give birth to children possessed by devils. Makes you think twice about adding a little variety to your Tuesday night. And it wasn't just about how you did it, when mattered too. No intimacy during Lent, Advent, or major feast days. Wednesdays and Fridays were off limits in some regions. Sundays were a sin. The night before, communion, absolutely not. Pregnant, nope. Breastfeeding, still no. Menstruating, forbidden. Let's just say medieval couples weren't exactly swimming in spontaneous opportunities. Yet despite the guilt-laced guidelines, humans remained human. Which means some people rebelled subtly or otherwise. In court records, there are scattered mentions of couples accused of unnatural acts. A polite phrase for basically anything other than the holy missionary mission. Some were punished with public penance, others with fines. A few were even excommunicated. And then there were the true believers, those who genuinely internalized the guilt. A nobleman might confess weekly about impure thoughts regarding his own wife. A peasant woman might fast after feeling desire. Guilt didn't discriminate by class. It crept into bedrooms across the board. One quirky tidbit: there were purity guides written for newlyweds. These sometimes included bizarre anatomical theories like the belief that pleasure was necessary for conception only in women, or that babies conceived during a full moon would be better looking, or that lying on your left side increased the chances of a girl. Science was ambitious. Of course, not every medieval thinker was a prude. Some medical texts, especially those translated from Arabic or Greek, acknowledged pleasure as a healthy, even necessary part of marriage. But these views were often buried beneath louder, stricter voices. So here you are, wondering if the flicker of desire you feel is divinely sanctioned or demonically inspired. You reach out anyway, cautiously. There's tenderness in the touch, a shared glance, maybe even a laugh at how absurd the rules are. And in that moment, you're not a sinner. You're just a person longing for closeness in a world that wraps love in chains. You whisper, careful not to wake the dog curled by the hearth, and shift under the blanket. Maybe missionary isn't so bad. Maybe rules were made to bend a little. Just don't forget to confess later. After all, you've still got a 40 lashes of penance and a rooster to sacrifice next Tuesday. You wake to the low tolling of a church bell and the distant chant of monks echoing across the valley. It's a sound you've heard since childhood, steady, serene, holy. But as you blink sleep from your eyes, you wonder what goes on behind those cloistered walls. Celibacy rite, silence and prayer. Not always. In theory, monks and nuns lived lives of abstinence and purity. They were married to God, devoted to spiritual work, and carefully separated by gender. But in practice, well, let's just say the vows didn't always stick. Behind those thick stone walls, desire still whispered, and sometimes it shouted. Monasteries were supposed to be islands of virtue in a sea of sin, but temptation had a way of washing ashore. Letters survive from medieval monks confessing impure dreams or sinful longings. Some wrote entire treatises on chastity filled with vivid metaphors that frankly revealed a bit too much imagination. Historians still argue whether monastic sexuality was rare and scandalous or quietly common and tolerated. There are records, lots of them, of monks sneaking out at night, of nuns becoming pregnant, of abbots covering up illicit affairs with generous donations to the church. One famous 14th century case involved a nun in Germany who gave birth and tried to hide the baby in a basket beneath the floorboards. She wasn't the first. She wasn't the last. The church didn't always look the other way. When caught, monks could be whipped, confined, or excommunicated. Nuns were often sent to stricter convents, or worse, married off to erase the scandal. But the rules didn't stop everyone. Secret passageways, coded messages, and late-night confessions became the tools of lovers cloaked in linen robes. One fringe tidbit. In some abbeys, monks and nuns wrote each other love poems. One 12th century letter from a nun named Heloise to her former lover Abelard is so emotionally raw that it still stings today. While I am denied your presence, give me at least the solace of your words. Not exactly your standard liturgical chant. And where did all these relationships begin? Often in education. Monasteries were centers of learning, and young novices studied Latin theology and each other. A shared glance across the scriptorium, a brush of the hand while passing ink. It sounds like a romantic novel, but it was very real. Forbidden love in the house of God. Not all monastics were secret sinners. Many truly embraced chastity and solitude. But even they struggled. One monk recorded in his diary that he beat himself with nettles every time he had lustful thoughts daily. Others fasted until dizzy or slept on cold stone to banish the warmth of temptation. Still, human nature prevailed. A nun in Italy once claimed to be miraculously pregnant by the Holy Spirit, only for a very human friar to be discovered visiting her chamber. You can guess how that story ended. Spoiler not with the second coming. Even the architecture had stories to tell. In some ruined monasteries, archaeologists have found hidden stairways and sealed-off alcoves, spaces designed not for prayer but for privacy. A testament, perhaps, to the age-old tension between vow and desire. So tonight, as the bell rings again, and your thoughts drift to that serene abbey on the hill, remember behind the chants and candlelight monks and nuns were still people. Lonely, curious, aching for connection. Their robes may have hidden their bodies, but not their hearts. And as you lie back beneath your humble thatch roof, you smile just a little, knowing that even the holiest among us once scribbled secret love notes by candlelight. You're browsing the local market when someone slips a bundle into your hand, a soft pouch filled with dried herbs tied up in red ribbon. You glance at the old woman who gave it to you. She doesn't speak, just winks. This, you learn, is a love charm, or maybe a curse. It depends on how it's used and how badly you want something to happen tonight. Welcome to the world of medieval folk magic, where superstition and sensuality often danced in secret together. When religion told you what not to do, herbalists and wise women told you what might work anyway. Across Europe, there was a thriving underground of natural love enhancers. Some were innocent rose petals soaked in wine or a sprig of mint worn on the wrist. Others, not so much. Crocodile dung wolf liver, dried frog hearts, or powdered bone. Yes, people were very committed to their crushes. Historians still argue whether these concoctions were genuinely believed to have power or simply acted as a placebo for nervous lovers. Either way, they were used and feared, because with every love spell came the suspicion of witchcraft. And that could be deadly. Let's say you're a woman. You want to keep your husband's affection, or maybe lure the blacksmith 2 stalls down. You might boil herbs like yarrow, vervain, and mugwort into a tea. You might bathe in rose water and chant a charm under the full moon. You might even bury a figurine beneath his doorstep. Risky, absolutely. But medieval life was full of risks, and love, especially the physical kind, was never entirely safe. One fringe detail. There were entire grimoires, magical handbooks dedicated to enhancing marital joy. Some of the advice bordered on modern sensual therapy, like stroking specific body parts in a clockwise direction or eating oysters soaked in honey. Others were just unhinged, burning a dove alive and inhaling the smoke to inspire passion. Do not try that one at home. For men, the pressure was different, but just as real. Unable to perform. That wasn't just embarrassing. It could be seen as a curse, a sign of infidelity, or even divine punishment. Men turned to tonics made from bull testicles, bear bile, or spiced mead boiled with antlers. Anything to restore their vital force. And if performance issues weren't enough, accusations of magical manipulation could ruin lives. A woman whose partner suddenly lost interest might be blamed for binding him with a spell. One tale from 15th century France tells of a baker's wife who was accused of casting a cold charm on her husband because he fell asleep early 3 nights in a row. He was fined. She was nearly drowned, but it wasn't all fear and suspicion. Many of these rituals were passed down lovingly from mothers to daughters, tucked between lessons on weaving and cooking. They were part of a broader female knowledge system, quiet resistance in a world that rarely allowed women to control their bodies, let alone their desires. And sometimes they worked, or at least people believed they did. That pouch you were given. It smells of lavender and dried apple blossoms. You carry it home, tuck it beneath your straw pillow, and whisper the charm just once shyly. Tonight, your partner reaches for your hand. There's no incense, no spell book, just a flicker of something tender and ancient between you. Was it the herbs, the placebo? Or maybe, just maybe, a little medieval magic still lingers in the air. You hear music in the distance, a tambourine, a laugh, a lute playing a tune that sounds suspiciously suggestive. You follow the sounds through the narrow streets until you reach a low building with a red lantern swinging at its door. Inside, warmth, candles, perfume, and the quiet hum of conversation. You've arrived at the medieval brothel, and no, you're not in trouble yet. Brothels in the Middle Ages occupied a strange space. They were sinful, yes, but regulated sin. In fact, in many towns, they were church-approved. That's right, the same institution that condemned nearly every bedroom behavior under the sun also collected taxes from houses of ill repute. Welcome to the contradiction that was medieval morality. You step inside, heart thudding. The madam greets you with practiced charm. She's not just the manager, she's the accountant, the security guard, the mediator, and sometimes the therapist. She ensures the women inside are dressed to the local standard, the wine is watered down just enough, and the priest across the street keeps looking the other way. Historians still argue whether this regulation was about compassion control or cold economics. In some cities, brothels were treated like essential services, especially for unmarried men, soldiers, or traveling merchants. Town councils set rules, prices, days of operation, and even uniforms. Yes, some sex workers were required to wear specific colors, often yellow or striped, so no one confused them for respectable women. And yet, despite these restrictions, brothels were places of real agency for some women. In a world where marriage could be a prison, and labor was brutal sex work, while dangerous offered rare income housing, and in some cases, community. A successful courtesan could earn more than a skilled craftsman. Some even bought property or retired comfortably. Others weren't so lucky. The dangers were real: disease, abuse, poverty, arrest, and the stigma never left. A woman might earn gold in youth only to be buried in a pauper's grave. Still, many formed friendships, defended each other, and developed systems of care. One fringe tidbit: some brothels had informal health inspections administered by midwives to prevent the spread of illness. Primitive, yes, but arguably ahead of their time. You sit at a wooden bench sipping mead. Around you, men joke, barter, flirt. But not everyone's here for pleasure. Some just want companionship. Others want a break from judgment. And some are just hiding from their in-laws. A woman sits beside you. She's wearing a garland of rosemary meant to ward off evil spirits. Her dress is faded but carefully mended. She asks you your name, not with seduction, but with curiosity. Because even here in a room painted by moral panic and candle smoke, human connection still flickers. Of course it can't last. The town reeve might barge in. The church might crack down again. Laws changed fast. Brothels could be tolerated one year, burned the next. During outbreaks of plague or famine, sex workers were often the first scapegoats. But for now, you exist in the strange moral loophole of medieval life where sin is acknowledged, even taxed, where judgment stands outside the door, waiting, and inside warmth, laughter, longing, and lives as complicated as any cathedral sermon. You rise to leave. The woman presses something into your hand. It's not a token, not an invitation. It's a sprig of rosemary, just a bit of protection, in case the world outside isn't as kind as the one in here. You're standing outside the cathedral now, squinting up at its towering stone spires. The bells are tolling for vespers, echoing through streets that smell of bread dung and wood smoke. You've heard the sermons, you know the rules. But what does the church really say about your more personal urges? The answer, frustratingly, is a lot, and also not nearly enough. The medieval church was obsessed with sex. Not in the way tabloids are today, but in a way that tangled divine law, social control, and genuine fear of eternal damnation. You couldn't escape its teachings. They were carved into pulpits, sung in chants, and whispered in confession booths. And the message was clear: sex was dangerous unless it was sanctioned. Sanctioned meant married, heterosexual, and strictly for procreation. No pleasure, no variation, no spontaneity. Missionary position: only please, and ideally with zero enthusiasm. Anything beyond that, and you were risking your soul, or at least a few centuries in purgatory. Historians still argue whether clergy actually expected people to follow these rules, or whether the teachings were more about setting a moral tone. Either way, the guidelines were specific and wild. For instance, sex was banned on Sundays, Fridays, holy days, feast days, and the 40 days before and after Easter. Add in Advent, Lent, and a handful of saint feast days, and you're looking at not a lot of action. Confession manuals from the era included long lists of marital sins, everything from undressing too slowly to enjoying it too much. Some even advised couples to pray afterward to ask forgiveness for the lust they might have felt toward their own spouses. You begin to see why people snuck off to folk healers and brothels. The church also preached that women were the more lustful sex descendants of Eve after all, and therefore needed to be controlled. But paradoxically, it also warned men to be vigilant against female temptation. This created a cultural whiplash where women were seen as both weak and dangerous. You can practically hear medieval couples arguing over whether to light a candle or call an exorcist. One fringe detail: there were monks and nuns who kept surprisingly intimate journals about their own struggles with desire. One 12th century monk described dreaming of angels who slowly turned into naked women. Another wrote of spiritual ecstasy that sure sounded like something else. The church may have condemned the body, but its servants were still very human. Of course, enforcement varied wildly. In rural villages, priests might turn a blind eye to discreet affairs. In cities, however, bishops cracked down hard. Adulterers could be whipped. Homosexual acts punishable by death in some regions. And accusations didn't always require proof, just gossip and a vengeful neighbor. But here's where it gets complicated. Not all church views were repressive. Some theologians argued that sex within marriage could be a gift from God, a bonding act. St. Thomas Aquinas famously warned against lust, but admitted that pleasure wasn't inherently sinful if properly ordered. A medieval loophole, if you will. Still, the dominant tone was fear. That your body could betray your soul. That a single act of passion could ripple into eternal consequence. It wasn't just about you and your partner. It was about cosmic order, divine judgment, and maintaining control over a population deeply dependent on the church for meaning and moral guidance. So you leave the cathedral with a conflicted heart. On one hand, you feel guilty for even wondering what lies beyond the rules. On the other, you're human, you're curious, and deep down you suspect the people delivering the sermons were too. You pass a group of choir boys practicing a hymn, their voices pure and reverent. but one sneaks a glance at a girl walking by and blushes to his ears. Maybe he'll confess it later. Or maybe, like most people, he'll carry the guilt, quietly blending holiness and hunger into the strange alchemy of medieval life. You're walking through the market again, but today something catches your eye. A stall not selling apples or ribbons, but potions, roots, and charms. A woman behind the table winks and whispers, "For love or for lust, congratulations. You've stumbled into the murky world of medieval aphrodisiacs and contraceptives." It might surprise you to learn that despite the church's grip and all those rules from the last section, medieval people really wanted control over their sex lives. And they got creative, sometimes brilliantly, sometimes disastrously. You bend down to examine a small jar of honey and herbs. The label reads, "To heat the blood." Tempting, if vague. Let's start with the aphrodisiacs. These weren't just luxury curiosities, they were part of common folk medicine. Onions, mustard seed, and nettles were believed to stir desire. Wine infused with cinnamon or cloves practically guaranteed to warm the humors. Even roasted sparrow brains had their moment of fame. Don't ask how they discovered that one. Fringe tidbit. Some recipes involved more questionable ingredients. Think bear bile, goat testicles, or powdered antlers. The idea was that consuming virile or aggressive animal parts would transfer that energy to you. Logical. Not really. But desperate times, desperate measures. Historians still argue whether these mixtures had any real effect or just operated on placebo and hope. What's certain is that people believed. They rubbed, drank, chanted, and prayed because the desire to spark passion was as strong as the desire to control it. Which brings us to contraception. Now here's where the myths and the records start to tangle. Officially, the church banned any attempt to prevent conception, calling it sinful obstruction. But unofficially, women across Europe passed down recipes and tricks through whispered female networks. No written manuals, of course, just word of mouth, often laced with superstition. Some used pessaries, inserted cloth soaked in vinegar, honey, or even olive oil. Others relied on timing herbal teas or charms worn on the body. Rue Pennyroyal and Queen Anne's lace were common women's herbs, sometimes brewed to delay or end pregnancy. And then there were the truly bizarre methods, amulets made from weasel testicles, crocodile dung suppositories. Hello again. Egypt, or spells recited during intercourse. You can almost hear the skeptical husbands going along with it just to keep the peace. Yes, darling, of course, the necklace made of dried mouse parts will work this time. But behind the oddness, there was a clear truth. People didn't just surrender to fate. They experimented, innovated, and protected themselves as best they could. Not always safely, but with intention. Of course, discovery could mean danger. A midwife caught distributing abortifacients might be charged with sorcery. A woman suspected of unnatural interference could face public shaming or worse. Yet these risks didn't stop the quiet exchange of knowledge, especially among women. In fact, for many, these herbal skills were a form of empowerment. You stopped to sniff one of the potions basil and wine apparently guaranteed to make him smile again. You raise an eyebrow, but something about the vendor's grin makes you wonder. Maybe it worked, or maybe it just helped people believe in their own power for a night. And as the market bustles on, you realize something profound. Despite centuries of shame, punishment, and moral panic, desire still found its way through. In plants and whispered recipes in the hands of the same women who birthed, healed, and buried their neighbors. Sex in the Middle Ages wasn't just governed by doctrine. It was shaped by curiosity, necessity, and countless acts of quiet resistance. One spoonful of potion at a time, it's well past curfew. The moon hangs low over the rooftops, casting a silver glow over chimney stacks and ivy-wrapped turrets. You duck into a shadowed alley not for mischief, but to avoid the eyes of your neighbors. Because tonight, you're meeting someone you aren't supposed to. Forbidden love. In the medieval world, wasn't just about passion. It was a balancing act of survival, secrecy, and danger. And when it came to sexual taboos, medieval society had very long lists. Let's start with who you were allowed to love, or rather who you weren't. Outside of marriage, already risky. But same-sex relationships, deeply taboo, though not entirely invisible. In fact, medieval Europe documented such encounters with a mix of panic fascination and at times surprisingly frank detail. Men found engaging in homosexual acts could be fined, shamed, exiled, or worse. Yet monasteries and courts often whispered of intimate bonds between men that blurred the line between friendship and love. The phrase brotherly affection sometimes meant much more. And some scholars argue that intense spiritual partnerships may have masked romantic ones. Historians still debate whether certain saints' relationships were platonic or, well, not. And for women, same-sex relationships between women were rarely mentioned, which led some to believe they simply didn't exist. Spoiler alert, they did. But female sexuality was so poorly understood that even theologians didn't quite know what to do with the idea. Some said it was impossible without a man present. Others claimed it could summon demons. One 13th century bishop insisted that if two women touched in bed, a devil would fill the void. Cheery fellow. You reach the edge of town, where the houses thin and the forest presses close. A figure waits under the trees, someone whose love you're not supposed to return. Maybe they're of the wrong class. Maybe they're already married. Maybe they're simply the wrong gender. But they're here, and so are you. Forbidden love stories were everywhere in medieval literature. From Tristan and Isolde to Lancelot and Guinevere, people couldn't get enough of doomed passion. Courtly love, the elaborate, often chaste longing between knights and noblewomen, became a whole genre. It was idealized, stylized, and sometimes a thin veil for very real affairs. But not all forbidden love was glamorous. In fact, it could be dangerous. Adultery might earn a noblewoman the stake. A serf caught sleeping with someone from a rival manor might be publicly whipped. And interfaith relationships between Christians, Jews, or Muslims were particularly fraught. In some towns, they were banned entirely. In others, quietly tolerated until politics changed. One quirky story. In 14th century France, a Christian tailor and a Jewish baker's daughter fell in love. They exchanged secret letters hidden in loaves of bread. The affair ended when the bishop got suspicious, though not before half the town had heard the tale. Some say their story inspired a local ballad. Others say it was all invented by the baker's jealous cousin. Either way, the oven never cooled again. You sit beside your lover heart pounding. There's no music, no audience, just the quiet crunch of leaves under your feet. You share a stolen moment, maybe a kiss, maybe just a touch. You know it can't last, but somehow that makes it matter even more. Because forbidden love isn't just about sex. It's about claiming something real in a world that wants to control every part of you. It's about risk and resistance, even if the only reward is a memory. And as the wind rustles the trees and the moon slips behind a cloud, you realize you're not alone. Across the centuries, countless others have met under similar skies, held hands in the dark, and dared to love when they weren't supposed to. Morning mist curls over the stone courtyard as you shuffle into line with a dozen others, all nervously clutching herbs, tokens, and whispered regrets. Today you're here not for punishment nor prayer, but penance. Because once the deed was done, whether it was real, imagined, or confessed under duress, someone had to pay the moral toll. And that someone, unfortunately, is you. Medieval people weren't just obsessed with rules about sex, they were equally obsessed with what came after. Specifically, how to repent for it. You find yourself face to face with a priest whose eyebrows alone could make a man cry. He holds a thick book, the penitential. This wasn't just scripture. It was a kind of medieval sin calculator. Committed adultery. That's 7 years of fasting. Slept with your spouse but on a holy day. 2 years and no cheese. Accidentally thought something impure during Mass. That's a week without meat and no bathing, which, let's be honest, might be the norm anyway. Historians still argue whether these penances were meant to purify souls or control bodies. The punishments could be physical, spiritual, or in some cases quite creative. One Anglo-Saxon penitential declared that a man who spilled his seed outside of marriage must sleep in a stream for 3 nights. Unsurprisingly, that one didn't stay popular. Sexual sins were often treated more harshly than violent crimes. A thief might be whipped. A woman caught in premarital relations, publicly humiliated. In some towns, she'd be made to parade through the streets in nothing but a shift, her hair shorn holding a candle half her size. Think of it as the medieval version of a viral public shaming. But it wasn't just the church doling out judgment. Community gossip was its own form of punishment. If word got around that you'd misbehaved, especially as a woman, you could lose your livelihood, your safety, even your name. Some were branded as fallen. Others, quite literally, were branded. Still, people found ways to cope. Some bribed confessors to lighten their penance. Others confessed sins they hadn't committed, hoping to seem more devout. And a few, especially in the upper classes, got off with little more than a stern talking to and a forced donation to a local chapel. Here's a fringe tidbit in 12th century France. One bishop reportedly offered indulgences to men who confessed after committing adultery with their wives, because he believed sex for pleasure, even in marriage, needed repentance. No word on how popular that bishop remained. You're assigned your penance: 3 months of fasting every Wednesday, no meat on Fridays, and daily recitation of psalms while kneeling on uncooked barley. It's oddly specific and deeply uncomfortable. You carry out your sentence with the kind of dedication only guilt can summon. The hunger makes your vision swim. The barley digs into your knees. And all the while you wonder, was it worth it? But here's the twist. Despite the fear, the shame, and the blistered knees, people kept sinning. Love, lust, and longing didn't disappear just because someone wrote them into a ledger. They slipped between the lines. They whispered in alleyways. They burned quietly, waiting for nightfall. Penance then wasn't just punishment, it was permission to start over. A reset button, even if that button was made of thorns. And as you rise, aching and starving, but a little bit lighter, you realize you're not the first. You're not the last. You're part of a long, exhausted procession of souls who've made mistakes, whispered their confessions, and hoped for mercy. You've wandered far from the towns and cathedrals now. The woods grow thicker, the air quieter, until you hear a voice singing softly in a language you don't recognize. You peer through the brush, and there she is, a woman with herbs in her hair and a crow on her shoulder. A so-called wise woman. Or if you're less charitable, a witch. Because not everyone followed the rules when it came to sex in medieval times. In fact, some chose to step completely outside them. These were the outcasts, the rebels, the ones whose lives and loves didn't fit the mold. And that made them dangerous. Witchcraft in the Middle Ages wasn't just about bubbling cauldrons and pointy hats. In its earliest phases, it was more medical than mystical. These women, sometimes men, held knowledge of birth fertility and pleasure. They brewed potions, whispered spells, and offered counsel when the village priest only offered guilt. And yes, some of their love spells worked, though historians still argue whether that was due to herbs, suggestion, or sheer human hope. A fringe tidbit. One 14th century manuscript described a charm involving a toad's eye, a red ribbon, and the phrase, Domine vultus mea, to ensure conjugal harmony. Interpret that however you like. But with that knowledge came risk. The church, suspicious of anyone outside its moral monopoly, began casting a longer shadow. By the late medieval period, especially, post-plague suspicion turned into full-blown paranoia. Midwives were accused of sorcery. Herbalists who made contraceptive teas were condemned. And anyone who dared to live alone, childless, or openly sexually well, they were just asking for trouble. You learn of a woman named Alzbeta who lived in Bohemia and offered safe abortions with dried pennyroyal. When a nobleman's daughter died in her care, Alzbeta was dragged to trial and burned, though half the town had once sought her help in secret. These contradictions ran deep, but the rebels weren't all women. Men who loved other men, monks who whispered their desires behind monastery walls, troubadours who sang of forbidden affairs, they too walked this perilous edge. Love and lust weren't crimes in themselves, but the wrong kind of love that could end your life. Still, they existed. In quiet corners, lovers passed messages stitched into sleeves. Secret marriages were held under moonlight. Some found fleeting joy before the law caught up. Others simply vanished into the woods like the woman before you, fading into myth. The authorities tried to snuff it out with fear, but passion is stubborn. It hides in stories, in lullabies, and carved initials on ancient tree trunks. Even when punished, it survives. You sit quietly beside the wise woman as she stirs something in a clay pot. It smells of lavender and vinegar. For the body, she murmurs, and for forgetting. She hands you a spoonful without asking your sin. As the night darkens, you understand something. All this time, the church tried to control the story. But out here in the quiet rebellion of love and self-knowledge, another story kept unfolding. Not everyone in the Middle Ages was afraid of desire. Some chased it. Some healed it. Some even worshipped it. They just had to do so in whispers in the dark under the watchful stars. The final candle gutters as you step through the heavy wooden door of your home. It's been a journey through brothels and monasteries, bathhouses and penitentials, whispers and warnings. You ease into a straw-stuffed mattress, the day's dust still clinging to your skin, and your mind drifts to what it all meant. Because now, after everything you know, the truth sex in medieval times wasn't just a matter of flesh. It was a battlefield where politics, religion, gender, and power all fought for control over your body. And at the heart of it all, you, or someone like you, just trying to feel something, love something, touch something even if it was forbidden. In noble courts, sex could be currency. Royal mistresses had influence. Kings had dozens of bastards. But outside the palace, your pleasure or your mistake could cost you everything. There was no privacy. Neighbors gossiped, priests listened, and even your bed could betray you. Mainstream historical fact, the church didn't just moralize its rules, had real legal consequences. A married couple refusing to consummate could be annulled. Women who bore children out of wedlock might be branded exiled or forced into cloisters. And men accused of impotence could be subjected to humiliating physical trials watched by witnesses who had no business being there. And yet, despite the fear, people found loopholes. Secret marriages in graveyards, hand-fasting rituals by moonlight, lovers' trysts in barn lofts or under festival bonfires cloaked in maypole music and ale-slick laughter. You think back to that fringe tidbit about medieval chastity belts, not the cartoonish iron contraptions, but the softer cloth-wrapped versions, occasionally used more as deterrents than as locks. Historians still argue whether they were real security devices or just myths exaggerated over time. In truth, most control didn't come from hardware. It came from shame, surveillance, and silence. But that silence was never complete. There were always scribbled poems, secret sighs, even graffiti. In a 12th century English monastery, a monk carved a Latin joke onto a wall about lustful thoughts during matins. It's still there centuries later, faded but unashamed. And so here you are, lying still, absorbing it all, the danger, the beauty, the absurdity. You wouldn't survive medieval sex, not with your modern expectations of autonomy, safety, and respect. But that's what makes this story powerful. Because those who did survive, especially women, queer people, and the poor, did so with ingenuity. They made love in a world that punished them for it. They found intimacy in the margins. They turned whispered desire into resistance. And now, as you listen to the wind rattle the shutters and the crickets begin their nightly hum, you feel it. A thread, delicate but unbroken, stretching from their beds to yours. Across time, across shame, across centuries of stifled longing and stolen kisses. You made it through, maybe just barely, but you made it. Word count 1068. Wind down 300 words. Let your breath slow now. The night is quiet again, and the flickering shadows have softened into stillness. The struggles, the punishments, the secrets, they're part of a world that no longer exists. And yet, echoes remain. Take a moment to stretch, to settle deeper into your blanket. The air feels a little cooler now, touched by centuries of sighs and silences. But you're safe. You're here. And history is behind you where it belongs. The people of the Middle Ages lived hard lives, often by candlelight, guided by faith and fear. But within that, they still found moments of love, of rebellion, of laughter in the dark. You saw what they endured, the shame they swallowed, the risks they took just to feel close to someone. You saw how rules tried to bend their hearts, but couldn't fully extinguish their desire to connect. And now in your warm room, maybe with a fan humming low in the corner, you can let it all go. Let the facts blur. Let the whispers drift away. All that's left is you and this calm, heavy quiet. Thanks for staying with me. You made it all the way through. I'll be right here next time you want another story. For now, close your eyes, sleep deep, and dream maybe of love letters hidden in sleeves and footsteps across torchlit stone. End of script. Sweet dreams.